is Rafa, and today we'll be on an adventure to see how my story connects to a historical event that took place in the 1780s when the King of Spain granted the title of nobility to a Filipino Chinese for organizing resistance against the British invasion of Manila in the 1760s. We will see how those events eventually connect to Quiapo, Manila, and somehow to me through my lolo, who was a Spanish speaker from Quiapo. Since they spoke Spanish, does that mean that my lolo was de alta sociedad, and so were his friends? Join me as we dive into this very interesting heritage adventure.
To tell Rafa's story, we will be using 6 degrees of separation to link through connections within the story. Our starting point is a Chinese Filipino called Song Tua and the significant events that happened in his life. First degree of separation. A Sangley named Song Tua in the 1700s fights for Spain. In the 1760s, the British invaded Manila for a brief period as part of the 7 Years' War. During that time, a Sangley de Filipinas by the name of Song Tua was said to have organized 1,500 volunteer Sangley regiment named after the Royal Prince of Spain to fight the British. Song Tua appeared to be a successful Chinese trader who had accumulated enough wealth to organize a resistance against the British, when most other people were just waiting for who would eventually win. Well, the British eventually left in 1764 at the conclusion of the war.
Okay, don't get excited. This is just the first step, and perhaps you were wondering if I were related to this Song Tua. We'll get the answer to that later on in the story. For now, let's continue. So, this Song Tua appears later on in the records with the Hispanized name, Don Antonio Tuason, with a significant name rearrangement from Song Tua to Tuason, Song Tua, Tuason, Song Tua, Tuason. Ring a bell? Of course it should, because this is the same Tuason family we know today as Tuazon, with a Z instead of an S, but it is the same family descended from Song Tua.
Second degree of separation. Don Antonio Tuason is elevated to Spanish nobility as a hidalgo. In gratitude for services rendered to the Spanish crown, the King of Spain, Carlos III, exempted Don Antonio Tuason from paying tributes for 2 generations in 1775. More significantly, the same king elevated Antonio Tuason to the ranks of Spanish nobility and given the title of a hidalgo in the 1780s. This was an astonishing fact to the insulares and peninsulares of today, that the Chinese Filipino was basically granted a Spanish title of nobility as a hidalgo. The title was not hereditary, and the main benefit really was that he would be subjected to tax exemptions and he could create an estate that would be given some rights and tax privileges. More of that in a while.
A bit of trivia. Don Antonio Tuason was the only Filipino of Chinese blood who ascended into Spanish nobility. From that time on, it is said that the family were removed of the roles of Sangley mestizos and became Spaniards by royal decree.
Third degree of separation. A noble estate or Mayorazgo is established. In the 1790s, with the approval of King Carlos IV, the same prince under whose name the Sangley regiment was called, Don Antonio Tuason then creates a Mayorazgo, a noble estate that could only be passed on from the eldest son onto the eldest son of the next generation. The Mayorazgo had tax privileges and the estate had to be preserved for the benefit of the whole family, even though it was passed on to the eldest son only. This meant that unlike normal estates that were divided among the heirs, there was no continuous subdivision of the estate as it was passed on from one generation to the next. This meant that the estate remained largely intact and in fact was expanded through time by the successive heirs. Fourth degree of separation. The Quiapo connection. Don Severo Tuason, Doña Teresa de la Paz. In the 1760s, the Mayorazgo was passed on to Don Severo Tuason, who married Teresa de la Paz of Marikina. In 1868, the couple moved from Binondo to a fashionable area in Quiapo along Calle San Sebastian that led the San Sebastian Church. The house itself was called Casa Grande or Big House, and in a place where the houses were already relatively big, the name Casa Grande said it all, and it was a place of lavish parties and social events by the elite of Manila. The street itself was said to be the most beautiful street at the time, the Forbes part of its time. However, Don Severo Tuason died, and in his will, he stated that the administration of the estate and the custody of the children would be jointly done by his brother Don Gonzalo and Teresa de la Paz, provided that the latter remained a widow. But things were not to be, as the most eligible widow of that time married again to a distant relative of her deceased husband, to a man named Don Benito Legarda.
Here's a bit of trivia. If the name sounds familiar, that's because Don Benito Legarda was the vice president of the Revolutionary Congress of Malolos in 1898. In a bit of irony, the descendants of a Filipino hidalgo raised to Spanish nobility found themselves caught in the independence movement and revolution against Spain. And by the way, the Tuason family was a Spanish-speaking family, and yet they were for independence from Spain. So, it's not true that if you spoke Spanish, you were pro-Spain and anti-Filipino, which some argue on social media even nowadays to show hostility in learning Spanish. Why? Even Hispanic America still speaks Spanish, but that doesn't mean that they are anti-nationalistic and pro-Spain.
As things stood therefore, the Mayorazgo appears to have gone to Don Gonzalo, but the house in Quiapo was left with Don Benito Legarda and Teresa de la Paz. Benito Legarda and Teresa de la Paz had 3 children, from which 3 families trace their roots: the Legarda family, the Prieto family, the Valdez family. Together with the Tuason family, these families still have family reunions under the banner of the descendants of Teresa de la Paz. In the end, the house in Calle San Sebastian ended up with Don Benito and Doña Teresa's daughter, Rita Legarda, who married Don Benito Valdez, and from which the Valdez line of Teresa de la Paz traces its roots.
It's also interesting to note that these were Spanish-speaking families, and up to now, during family reunions, Spanish can still be heard among the conversations. Although, of course, so are English and Tagalog. It should also be added that as of today, although there are wealthy families amongst the descendants, most are really working-class people, with some still speaking Spanish. Therefore, it is not true that if you spoke Spanish, that meant that you were part of the wealthy elite. In the same way nowadays, both the elite and the working class speak English. Therefore, speaking English cannot mean that you are wealthy and part of the alta sociedad. So it is clearly an unchallenged assumption that speaking Spanish is being elitist, as I know many people who speak Spanish and they are common people. Some are trying to learn Spanish because of current economic opportunities, such as in the BPO space. But where exactly does my story come in? We go to the next stage then, as we are now approaching that angle.
5th degree of separation, Quiapo, growth in the American period and post-war decay. Dr. Benito Legarda later became a member of the Philippine Commission and was even the resident commissioner from the Philippines to the U.S. Congress from 1907 to 1912. By 1913, it appears that Calle San Sebastian was renamed R. Hidalgo Street in honor of the renowned Philippine painter Felix Resurrection Hidalgo. So in quite a turn of events, the descendants of a Filipino Hidalgo would later on be found living on a street called Hidalgo as well, in Quiapo, Manila. The Quiapo of this time was a very desirable place to live in. It was now the heart of Manila, with theaters, schools, universities, and 2 famous churches. Escolta was the Beverly Hills of the time, full of luxury shops, international companies, and was a classy business district. This meant that people naturally flocked to Quiapo and started to live in the expanding arrabales or suburban areas around the place, especially the working class, as there were jobs and plenty of economic opportunities in such a vibrant city. In these places, accessoria started to sprout, with stores on the ground and the upper floor being the living area of the occupants. Now some bit of trivia. The Mayorazgo was eventually dissolved in 1926, with the estate divided, although it should be noted that Spain itself had already decreed sometime in the 1800s that Mayorazgo were supposed to be disentailed already. Anyway, during the time of the Commonwealth period, President Manuel L. Quezon wanted a new city outside of Manila and had some of the land that were formerly within the old Mayorazgo to be used to develop that city, which we now know as Quezon City, with large tracts of land formerly part of the Tuason estate. Then World War II came and the whole situation changed. And the house in R. Hidalgo Quiapo, the Legarda Valdez family and relatives actually stayed there for the duration of the war. The Japanese too were keeping an eye on the house, as one of its famous sons was bound to visit the place in due time. General Basilio Valdez, formerly Chief of the Army and then Secretary of National Defense under President Manuel L. Quezon, working with General Douglas MacArthur. Fortunately, this side of the Pasig was not as devastated as the Intramuros side, and the family survived the Japanese occupation.
It is generally held that Quiapo started deteriorating post-World War II to the Quiapo that we know now today. Dirty, in disrepair, and in need of restoration. There are numerous heritage sites that ought to be preserved for future generations to appreciate. In our next episode, we shall talk about the efforts to restore Quiapo as a cultural heritage site. For now, there is a tour called Renacimiento, Manila, and we have added the details about it in the description page of this video. Furthermore, I've come to know some of the descendants of the Valdez family. They are clearly working class people, and not all spoke Spanish anymore, although some still could understand it, having been exposed to a Spanish-speaking environment. This clearly got me to think, just like Quiapo being a heritage site in need of recovery, perhaps Spanish is also in the same stage. It's largely almost forgotten, although a small minority still speak it today. Just like Quiapo is considered a heritage site, shouldn't Spanish be considered a heritage language as well? After all, it is part of Filipino history and culture. Anyway, no, I am no way related to the Valdez family, but we are already nearing the end of my story, so let's move on.
6th degree of separation. A family from Iloilo moves to Quiapo in 1912. During the early American colonial regime, an Ilonggo couple named Elias Aldeguer y del Prado and Maria Consuelo Conluilocsin moved from Iloilo as their house burned down, and they decided to move somewhere else where there were economic opportunities. Thus, Quiapo beckoned, and they moved to the area where they raised 11 children. One of their sons, Manuel Conlu Aldeguer Sr., married Trinidad Unson Lontoc of Batangas and moved into the accessorias of Castambide, a working-class residential home. And yet, they spoke Spanish. They had 5 children, the fourth one being Eduardo Aldeguer y Lontoc, who married Leonor Boliosos y Barrientos of Camiguin.
Eduardo Aldeguer was my lolo who spoke Spanish at home. However, they were not upper-class people. But here's the thing, they spoke Spanish. But just like most families after their generation, Spanish was not successfully handed down to subsequent generations, although my lolo, his immediate family, close friends, and other relatives continued to speak Spanish amongst themselves. So we went from Ituazon Hidalgo to Ere Hidalgo in Quiapo, which led to the accessorias of Gastambide, to my family through my lolo and his friends who spoke Spanish, and to my quest for Filipino Spanish. During this quest, I found out the following. Spanish was spoken not just by the elite, but by the working class people as well, as exemplified by my lolo. So it doesn't necessarily mean that you were elitist if you spoke Spanish. Speaking Spanish did not mean you were anti-Filipino, just as speaking English nowadays does not mean you are anti-Filipino. People just spoke Spanish back then, that even the leaders of the revolutionary government against Spain spoke Spanish as a symbol of resistance and patriotism. For one reason or the other, the generation of my lolo wasn't able to pass on Spanish to later generations, for reasons we will try to delve into in a future episode. Quiapo appears to be a good metaphor for the state of Spanish in the Philippines. Both are in need of repair and conservation. Quiapo as a heritage site, and Spanish as a heritage language. Our story doesn't really end here, as there is so much more to talk about in the future. For now, having seen this episode, I wonder how many of you, dear viewers, actually related to my story. How many of you know of a relative, perhaps lolo or lola, or tito or tita, who can still speak Spanish? Write a comment down below and leave us a quick story as we try to unearth the remnants of the Filipino Spanish variant. Finally, if you believe that there's nothing wrong with Filipinos speaking Spanish, and that, like Quiapo, Spanish should be considered a cultural heritage, and that Spanish is a heritage language, please leave a like and subscribe to our channel in order to spread the word and promote our advocacy. As a final note, why then did my lolo speak Spanish? For that, I refer you to episode 1, where we discussed that Spanish was really spoken in the Philippines before, and not because he was elite. He was a prime example of Spanish being extensively used in the Philippines even during the American colonial regime. Please join us again for part 2 of for Quiapo Adventures on the next episode. Vivan los Filipinos! Mabuhay ang mga Filipino!